A lie is carved into the shape of this land, and almost no one who passes through ever thinks to question it. In the Searing Gorge, the verdict seems to write itself. A valley scorched down to its bones, ash where soil should be, a great wound in the earth where fire came howling up from beneath the world and burned everything it touched to cinder. Anyone who stands on that cracked ground and feels the heat rising through the soles of their boots arrives at the same conclusion within a single breath. Fire did this. Fire is the villain of the story. The land was innocent, and something terrible was done to it. And that reading is not wrong, exactly. It is simply incomplete in the way that all comfortable stories are incomplete. Because the fire did not choose to come. The fire was called. It was reached for, deliberately, by a hand that wanted something the world was not willing to give. And the ruin we blame on the flames was already written into that hand long before it ever opened. So here is the question I have carried with me across every visit to that blackened place. The question I have never quite been able to lay down. What truly turns a mountain into a wasteland? The fire that consumes it, or the hunger that summons the fire? My name is Keeper Aldrich. In my younger years, I studied among the Kirin Tor in Dalaran, and later I walked the long roads with the Explorers League, kneeling in the dust of ruins that had outlived the people who built them. I have stood at the rim of the Searing Gorge more than once, and I have come to believe that of all the ruined places in the world, it is the most honest, because it refuses to let us pretend that catastrophe simply happens to us. Some catastrophes we build, some we dig for, and some we summon with our own mouths. To understand what the gorge is, we have to refuse to trust what it looks like, because it did not always look like this. Before the ash, the likeliest reading is that this was green. Here I must be careful, because the chronicles do not set down the valley as it stood before the disaster. That country left almost nothing of itself behind. What the records do establish plainly is where it sat. This was once a part of the southern Redridge Mountains, the same range that still rises, unburned, in the lands to the east. And from what that range still is today, a country of stone and slope and growing things, we can reasonably picture what was lost here. A living place, water moving through it, things that grew. Had you walked it more than 2 centuries past, before the wound was opened, you would not have recognized a single feature of the country the maps now show. There was no cauldron gouged into its heart. There was no sea of cinders. There were no fire elementals drifting across the flats like the ghosts of a fever. No lava seeping through fissures that never fully close. No scorched creatures adapted to a heat that should kill anything at all. All of that came later. All of that was made. What survives now is a catalog of aftermath. The great excavation at the center of the region, the rift they named the Cauldron, dug so deep and so wide that it splits the valley like a broken jaw. The slag pit beneath it, where the ore runs richest and the air runs thickest. Firewatch Ridge and Pyrox Flats, and the Grime Silt dig site, names that sound less like places than like verdicts. And over it all, blackening the horizon to the south, the mountain that was not there before either, Black Rock, the volcano that erupted into being on the day the valley died. When I say the land was made, I mean it precisely. Nearly everything the traveler sees in the Searing Gorge is younger than the disaster. The disaster is the oldest thing there. So the fire is real, and the ruin is real. But the fire is the end of the story, not the beginning. And if we want to understand why a green valley became a furnace, we have to go back before the summoning, back before the mountain, back to a grudge nursed in the dark by a people who had lost the one thing they could not forgive losing. The story does not begin with fire. It begins with an inheritance and with the death of the dwarf who held it. For a long age, the dwarven people lived as one beneath the mountain of Iron Forge, under the rule of High King Modamus Anvilmar. 3 great clans dwelt together in that hall: the Bronzebeards, the Wild Hammers, and the Dark Irons, bound by blood and by the shared stone over their heads. But shared stone is not the same as shared trust, and when the old king died, the thing that had been held together only by his authority came apart all at once. Each clan believed the mountain and the crown should be theirs. None would yield to the others. What followed, the records call the War of the Three Hammers, and it was the bitterest kind of war there is, the kind fought not against a stranger, but against a brother, over a house you all grew up in. In that war, the Dark Irons were beaten, cast out of Iron Forge, driven from the mountain that had been their home as much as anyone's. They went into exile carrying a wound that would never scar over. Their leader was a sorcerer of terrible ability, a figure the chronicles remember as Sorcerer-Thane Thaurissan. He led his defeated people south and east into the beauty of the Redridge Mountains, and there he raised a city and named it for himself. Thaurissan, a capital built by the dispossessed, a throne lifted up by those who had been thrown down. And there, in the years that followed, he did what the dispossessed so often do. He did not build a new life. He nursed the memory of the old one. He plotted to take back what had been taken. I want to be careful here, because this is the hinge on which the whole tragedy turns, and it is easy to reduce it to something cheaper than it was. We call this story the price of greed, and we imagine greed as a simple lust for gold. But the greed that drives Thaurissan is older and hungrier than that. It is the refusal to accept a loss. It is the conviction that what was once yours is yours forever, that any hand which took it from you is a thief, that no defeat is ever truly final so long as you are willing to reach far enough to reverse it. That is the deepest form the hunger takes, not the desire to have more than others, the desire to unmake the moment you were made to have less. And so the exile became an aggressor. Years into his brooding, Thaurissan launched his war of return, and he launched it with the cunning of a sorcerer who understood leverage. He divided his enemies so they could not aid one another. He himself led an assault upon Iron Forge, the mountain he meant to reclaim, and to the north, against the Wildhammer stronghold of Grim Batol, he sent his wife, the sorceress Modgood, no lesser power than himself. 2 hammers falling at once on 2 anvils, so that neither could turn to shield the other. It should have worked. It very nearly always does, when the calculation is that cold. But it did not. At Iron Forge, King Madarin Bronzebeard held the line and broke the dark iron assault against the roots of the mountain. At Grim Batol, King Cardros Wildhammer met Modgood in the fighting and struck her down. Both hammers shattered on the anvil, and the surviving dark irons, their sorceress dead and their armies broken, fled back toward the city that bore their leader's name, with the combined might of the Bronzebeards and the Wildhammers, no longer divided, no longer distracted, marching south behind them to finish what the war had started. This is the moment where a wiser people or a humbler one would have stopped. The reaching had failed. The grasp had closed on nothing. Every hand Thaurissan had thrown out to reclaim his stolen inheritance had been cut off at the wrist. There was nothing left to seize. There was only the question of how to survive the consequences of having tried. But the hunger does not know how to stop. That is its nature. That is the thing the gorge exists to teach. And Thaurissan, cornered in the ruins of his ambition, with an army of his kin closing in, did not lay down his reaching hand. He opened it wider than any dwarf had ever dared. He reached past the world entirely and closed his fingers around something that had been sleeping since the world was young. Here we arrive at the act itself, and I have stood in the place where it happened. So let me tell it plainly. Trapped and desperate, sensing that no force of arms remained to him, Thaurissan turned to the one power he had left, his sorcery, and the forbidden lore he had spent his exile studying. He was not alone. 7 of his most trusted and most powerful followers stood with him, and together the 8 of them descended into the deep places beneath the mountains and called upon the ancient powers sleeping under the world. What he sought was a servant, a supernatural minion, a summoned thing of sufficient force to sweep his brother's armies away and hand him the victory that battle had denied. He believed he was reaching for a weapon he could command. He was reaching, instead, for a master. What answered the summoning was not a servant of any kind. It was Ragnaros, the Fire Lord, the immortal lord of all fire elementals, a being so old and so terrible that the Titans themselves had banished him from the surface of the world in the earliest ages, chaining him away in the elemental plane where he could do no more harm. For an age beyond counting, he had waited there, and Thaurissan's spell broke the chain. The Fire Lord erupted back into being in a single apocalyptic instant, and the reaching hand, the sorcerer, the 8, the whole desperate ambition of a people who could not accept defeat, was the very first thing the fire consumed. Thaurissan died in the moment of his triumph, killed instantly by the thing he thought he had conquered. But the Fire Lord did not stop with him. Ragnaros' arrival tore the land itself apart. The Redridge Mountains, the beautiful range where the exiles had built their city, buckled and shattered in a series of explosions that flattened everything for a vast distance in every direction. Where the mountains had stood, a new volcano heaved itself up out of the ruin. Black Rock Mountain, born in fire on the day the valley died. The city of Thaurissan was reduced to rubble in an instant, its towers and its throne and its plotting all thrown down into the same dust it had been raised from, and the land was split into 2 blackened halves by the force of it. The scorched steppes to the south of the new mountain became the burning steppes, and the ruined valley to the north, the country that, by every sign the record preserves, had once been green, became the Searing Gorge. And here, at last, the false verdict collapses. The fire did not descend on an innocent land out of a clear sky. The fire was pulled into the world by the hand of the very people who lived there in a final act of grasping after a victory they had no right to expect. The wasteland is not something that happened to the Dark Irons. The wasteland is something the Dark Irons made, and then had to live inside. And so my question returns to me, heavier than before. What turned this mountain into a wasteland? Not the fire. The fire was only the instrument. What turned it was the refusal, held for years in the dark of an exile's heart, to accept that some things, once lost, are simply gone. And yet even this is not the end of the greed. This is the part of the story that undoes me every time I return to it. because you would think that such a catastrophe would be enough. You would think that a people who had reached so far that they burned their own world down around themselves would at last unclench the hand. They did not. The survivors of the summoning did not go free. Ragnaros, the master they had mistaken for a servant, enslaved them. The remnant of the Dark Iron clan was bound to the Fire Lord's will within the mountain their own folly had raised, and there they remained, in chains, in the heat, in the ruin of everything they had reached for. By any reckoning, the story should end here as a warning. This is what the hunger costs, and here is the grave it digs. But the hunger, I have learned, does not die when the reason for it dies. It simply looks for the next thing to close its hand around. In time, the Dark Irons built themselves a new capital, Shadowforge City, deep beneath the mountain. And then, with a home restored and a people regathered, they lifted their eyes to the ruined valley to the north, the very crater their catastrophe had carved, and they saw not a monument to their doom, but an opportunity. They saw ore, for the blackened valley, it turned out, was rich beneath its ash. Gold ran in veins through the broken stone. Mithril and true silver waited in the deep seams. The disaster had split the earth open and laid its treasures bare, and the people whose greed had cracked it looked upon that exposed wealth and felt the old hunger stir again, undiminished, as though nothing at all had been learned. So they began to dig. The excavation they carved into the heart of the gorge came to be called the Cauldron, and it is exactly what its name suggests, a vast rift torn into the floor of the valley, wide enough and deep enough to swallow towns, worked from top to bottom in the endless pursuit of what lay within. Beneath it, they settled the Slag Pit, an underground mining site richest of all in ore, and there the true labor of the operation was done. But I want to be exact about who did that labor, because it is the detail that reveals everything. The digging was not done by the Dark Irons themselves. It was done by slaves, captured enemies for the most part, dragged into the pit and worked in the dark and the heat to pull riches out of the ground for masters who were themselves enslaved. A people in chains, forcing others into chains, so that all of them together could tear wealth from the ruin that their own reaching had created. If you wanted a single image to hold the entire meaning of the word greed, you could not find a better one than the Cauldron. It is greed digging into the wreckage of greed, with a shovel held by a hand that greed has already broken. I made camp once at the northern lip of that great rift, in the failing light, with the glow of the slag pit rising faintly from below like a fire that has forgotten how to go out. I did not sleep well. There is a particular quality to the silence over a place like that, not peace, but exhaustion. The silence of a wound that has been opened so long it has forgotten it was ever whole. And standing there, I understood something the histories never quite say aloud. The Cauldron is not a mine that happens to sit in a ruin. The Cauldron is the ruin continuing. The disaster did not end when the fire cooled. It simply changed its shape from an explosion into an excavation, and went on consuming. And it consumed more than ore. The digging never truly stopped, and it drew others in over the years. Not only the Dark Irons, but scavengers and diggers of every kind, prospectors who came to pry at the open seams, archaeologists who came to read what the shattered ground had laid bare of older ages. The grime-silt dig site still marks where the Dark Irons themselves turned their tools to unearthing the past as well as the present. and the land answered all of them the way ruined land always answers those who come to strip it, with hazard. There is a story I am fond of precisely because it is so small against the great tragedy around it. It concerns a beast called Margol the Rager, a monstrous kodo that made itself the terror of every archaeologist who ever set foot in the gorge, until at last a single adventurer was rewarded with passage into the region for putting the creature down. It is a footnote, but it tells you what kind of place the gorge had become. A land so hostile that the mere act of studying it required a hero. A land that fought back against every hand that reached for it and never entirely lost. There is a further truth in the creatures that came to live there, and it is one worth pausing on, because the land did not merely die. It was remade into something that only fire could inhabit. On the flats today, you will not find the beasts of a valley. You will find fire elementals and lava elementals, drifting and pooling where the heat runs closest to the surface. You will find incendosaurs, scaled things that thrive in temperatures that would kill any ordinary animal. Golems of stone and slag stalk the dig sites. Even the few plants that returned came back fire-shaped. The herb the gatherers call fire bloom grows in the scorched ground as though the land could no longer imagine any other kind of life. This is what a wasteland truly is, not an absence of life, but a replacement of it, where everything soft has been burned away and only the things that love the flame remain. The gorge did not become empty. It became a country that belongs to fire, populated by fire's own children, and that transformation is perhaps the most permanent thing the disaster achieved. And a country that belongs to fire draws other things that hunger. A broken place is never left alone for long, because ruin advertises itself to every predator with the wit to read it. In later years, before the great invasion that would open the way to Outland, a band of the Burning Legion's demons descended upon the Searing Gorge, led by one called High Lord Cruel, drawn to the already wounded land the way Carrion calls the crow. The forces of Ragnaros himself never entirely relinquished their grip upon the region either, and the Fire Lord's cults would return again and again to stir the old fire back to life. This is the quieter cost the histories rarely tally. When greed hollows a place out and sets it alight, it does not only destroy what was there, it rings a bell that every other hunger in the world can hear, and one by one they come to feed on the wreckage. The gorge became not only a monument to one people's ruin, but an open invitation to everyone else's. For a long time, too, the gorge kept itself sealed against the wider world. The old road north through the stone-wrought pass was locked down and held shut, guarded by the mountaineers of the Bronzebeards, who turned away anyone who sought passage into the ruin, as though the living dwarves of the north had decided the wasteland was better left behind a wall. And perhaps they were right. Perhaps some ruins should be sealed. But sealing a thing away does not undo it. It only spares you the sight of it. And the digging in the cauldron went on all the same, behind the locked pass, in the dark, the way such things always do. Now I have told you the story as the price of greed, and every fact of it supports that telling. But I would be a poor keeper of records if I let you leave without the doubt, because the gorge itself holds a second reading, quieter than the first, and I have never been able to decide which of them is true. There are those among the Dark Irons themselves who insist that greed was never the origin of their ruin at all. One of their own, A figure the records name Franklorn Forgewright is said to have argued that his people were not always as the world now knows them, not always manipulative, not always cruel, not always ruled by the fiery hunger that dug the cauldron. He held, or so the accounts suggest, that these traits were not native to the dark iron soul, but were burned into it afterward by the influence of Ragnaros himself. That reading, if it holds, would mean the Fire Lord did not merely enslave their bodies. It would mean he reshaped their nature, twisted a proud and stubborn people into an image of his own consuming fire, so that the greed we blame for everything was less a cause of their fall than a symptom of it. Followed to its end, the record carries a colder implication than the simple morality tale allows. Perhaps the hand that reached for Ragnaros was already greedy, or perhaps the greed we see is only the fingerprint Ragnaros left on the hand after he took hold of it. I cannot resolve this for you, and I will not pretend to. The honest answer is that the chronicles do not preserve enough to settle it, and the two readings coil around each other in a way that may never come apart. But I will say this: whether the greed came first and summoned the fire, or the fire came first and forged the greed, the result written into the land is the same. A people consumed, a valley ruined, a hunger that outlived every reason to hunger. The gorge does not care which explanation we prefer. It simply burns. And yet, and here at last, the gorge offers something that is not despair. Not every dwarf in that blackened country chose to keep reaching. There is a group there who broke the pattern, and they matter more than their small numbers suggest. They are called the Thorium Brotherhood, and their story is a strange mirror of the clan they left. They are dark iron dwarves, the same stock as the diggers in the cauldron, the same fire in the blood, the same fierce and stubborn genius for the forge. For most of their history, they belonged to that same clan, dwelling in the deep halls beneath Blackrock alongside their kin, sharing in the long servitude their people had fallen into beneath the Fire Lord's shadow. By birth and by temperament, they should have been no different from the masters of the pit. Everything about where they came from pointed toward the same ending, and then, unlike the rest, they let go. At some point, the Thorium Brotherhood broke ties with the Dark Iron Clan entirely. They walked away from Shadowforge City and from the endless war against the world, and they sought instead to build honest relations with the very peoples the clan had always fought, trading their craft, offering their skill, seeking connection rather than conquest. For this, the Dark Irons named them enemies, which tells you how deep the pattern runs. To a people defined by grasping, the act of opening the hand looks like betrayal. The Brotherhood established themselves at Thorium Point, on the cliffs at the northern edge of the gorge, directly overlooking the cauldron, and there they remain, keeping watch over the pit their former brethren still work, close enough to see the old hunger at its labor, and far enough to have stepped outside it. What strikes me most about the Brotherhood is that they did not become gentle. They did not renounce their nature. They are still dark irons to the bone, stubborn, fierce, consumed by their craft. Their blacksmiths are rumored to be among the finest in all of Azeroth, holding knowledge so rare they can forge the very arms and armaments of the Fire Lord's own design. The hunger to master, to make, to be the best at the work of their hands, that never left them. They simply turned it toward a different end. The same fire that drove Thaurissan to reach past the world and pull down a god is the fire that drives the Thorium smiths to their anvils. It is the identical hunger. The Brotherhood is the proof that the hunger itself was never the whole story. What damns a people is not that they burn. It is what they choose to reach for while the fire is in their hands. So I return one last time to the question I have carried through the ash of that place. What turns a mountain into a wasteland? Not the fire. I am sure of that much now. The fire was only ever the tool, and not the ore, and not the digging, and not even the greed alone, though the greed did the reaching, and the greed paid the price. What turned this mountain into a wasteland was a refusal, the refusal to ever unclench the hand, to accept a loss, to let a thing be gone. Thaurissan could not accept the loss of Iron Forge, and so he reached and burned his people into slavery. And his people, enslaved in the crater of that reaching, could not accept even then that there was nothing left worth grasping. And so they dug, and the disaster simply went on, wearing a new face. Every stage of the ruin is the same act repeated. A hand that will not open, a hunger that will not rest even in the ashes of what it destroyed. The Searing Gorge is the shape that hand leaves in the world. It is greed made into geography, a valley that was green and living, hollowed out and set alight, and left to smolder for centuries, not by an enemy, not by fate, but by the people who called it home, reaching for one thing more than they were ever meant to hold. And the terrible mercy of the place is that it keeps no secret about it. Every other ruin I have knelt in tried to hide its cause, buried it under time and dust, and the kind stories the survivors told. The gorge hides nothing. It burns in the open. It says, as plainly as scorched earth can say anything, that the fire we most need to fear is not the one that falls upon us from outside, but the one we open our own mouths to summon in the moment we decide that losing is the one thing we will not survive. The fire in the gorge has been burning for more than 2 centuries now. The ore still comes up out of the cauldron. The hunger still holds the shovel. And somewhere on the cliffs above it, the ones who finally let go are still watching, still working their own anvils, proof that the fire could always have been turned to something other than ruin. If only the hand had been willing to open before the whole world had to burn to pry it loose. That is the record of the Searing Gorge. I set it down here as I found it. A green valley, a lost mountain, a grudge that would not die, and a fire that a desperate people mistook for a servant in the last moment before it became their master. Make of the warning what you will. The gorge has already made of it a wasteland.